Welcome back to the Global Landscapes Forum 2019 here in very, very sunny Bonn. It's just getting sunnier. And where we will be focusing on rights in the landscape here at the GLF. And this afternoon I have with me Kathrin Wessendorf,
yes.
Who is the head of programs at IWGIA, a global human rights organization dedicated to promoting, protecting and defending Indigenous people's rights. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you. So your organization just launched the Indigenous World 2019, yes. Which is a comprehensive annual report overview of Indigenous people's rights. Please tell us more about that.
The Indigenous World is actually, we have published this every year for 33 years, so since 1987.
Okay.
Yes, I think I calculated right.
Yes, you're right.
And it is a comprehensive overview of what happened in the Indigenous world the past year. So it includes 62 country reports. This issue in 2019 includes 62 country reports on the developments in, for example, policies, but also in rights violations or positive developments in 62 countries all over the world, and also updates on 13 international processes. For example, what have been the discussions in the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, but also what have been the discussions in the UNFCCC, in the Climate Convention framework. And so it basically updates on what is the situation of Indigenous peoples of the world. And this year's book is focusing on the issue of Indigenous rights defenders, because we believe that this issue is really becoming more and more something that we see developing more. There are more and more human rights violations globally, and Indigenous peoples are particularly affected by that trend. Right. It's really a global trend. Right.
And what do you mean by global trend as a defender? Is it getting more dangerous or more? Yes.
Yeah, it's getting more dangerous to defend your land. And Indigenous rights defenders are land defenders typically, because they defend their right to their land, territories and natural resources.
Right.
Indigenous people's rights defenders can also be collective defenders. So, for example, it can be a community defending its right to lands and territories and natural resources. So that also, and that relation to land, which is really central for Indigenous peoples, is really something that is putting them also at risk, because one of the major crises for Indigenous peoples is land grabbing.
Right.
Land grabbing by big corporations, by governments, because of the global need for natural resources. And most of the remaining natural resources are on Indigenous peoples' land.
Right.
So that intersection between being strongly related to lands, depending on the natural resources, and the global need for non-renewable resources on those lands is really something that threatens Indigenous peoples particularly. Yeah.
Right. So in terms of rights in the landscape, what are your main challenges in trying to secure rights for Indigenous people?
Well, that's very different for different countries.
Yeah.
I mean, in some countries you have very good legislation, you have a constitution that recognizes Indigenous people's rights, but even in those countries the implementation gap is very big. I mean, really, the implementation of these rights is really something that needs much more attention. In other countries, Indigenous peoples are not even recognized. The government doesn't even recognize that there are Indigenous peoples in the country. And of course, that is a completely different situation, and you have to start at a very different point for protecting and defending the rights of Indigenous peoples.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my question was, like, in terms of, because legal frameworks take a long time to put in place. It's always like long-winded, and we're at a point where we're at crunch time. We don't have time. So how is that going to happen where we're trying to secure rights or even get Indigenous people's rights to be recognized in this point of this crisis before things go downhill? Like how is that going to work?
I think there is, I mean, at the international level, there has been a lot of progress in terms of recognizing Indigenous people's rights. And the international community has an obligation to now implement those rights.
Right.
So there is an obligation to push for the implementation at national level and at local level. But there is also really, I mean, the Indigenous movement is is getting stronger in many countries and many regions, and is empowered and is really taking steps. So I think there is also a need to support that indigenous movement, to support indigenous peoples who are really defending themselves.
Right.
So rather than for the international communities, international NGOs taking steps to protect their rights, is to support indigenous peoples that are actually defending their rights and that are actually defending their rights. I think yesterday in many of the sessions, indigenous people said, we're not only defending our natural environment for ourselves, we're actually defending them for everybody.
Yes.
Because if we are conserving our nature and we are having rights to our lands, this is for the good for everyone. So there needs to be support for that fight. There needs to be alliances. There needs to be solidarity with the indigenous movement that is fighting for its rights.
Right, yes, because I mean the lands that they are on are the ones that are still, like virgin territory that haven't been destroyed by, development and the rest of it. So if we don't protect their rights, then I guess...
Exactly. Most of the preserved forests areas are in indigenous people's lands.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yes, we're in an interesting juncture, I guess, at this time. Are there any opportunities that you're seeing because we're facing a crisis? Because we can turn this, disaster into an opportunity that could change the mindsets of, corporations and governments. Are you seeing that there's maybe ways in?
Well, the opportunity, I think, is that there is more awareness of indigenous people's rights, of the situation of indigenous peoples. I mean, just that the Global Landscape Forum is focusing on rights really also shows that there is much more awareness of the need to protect those rights. So that's an opportunity. Unfortunately, as an organization, we are very often asked for best practices. It's very difficult to find those best practices, to be honest, because there is, again, such a huge implementation gap. We have really progressed at the international level, but the implementation at the local level, I mean, actually in contrary, I think we have really seen a reversal of indigenous people's rights,
Wow.
Which is really sad.
Yes.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is? Is there...
Well, I think that generally human rights have in recent years backstepped. So that's a global trend which affects indigenous peoples as well.
Right.
But I also think that, well, we all know extractive industries have violated rights. But we also have to be really careful if we talk about climate actions, for example, because climate actions or conservation measures can just as much violate rights. So while the global community or everyone is striving to do something against CO2 emissions or to design climate action, sometimes that is forgotten. Right, because we in IFGIA really believes that if we don't take rights seriously in a climate action context, we will not succeed with climate actions. I mean, it's really the basis is that you respect and you protect and you promote indigenous people's rights. Right. Also in that context.
Yes, I totally agree.
Yeah.
So looking towards the future, I know it looks very bleak at the moment.
Yes, I'm sorry.
I'm
very sorry. It's not even something to laugh about.
No, it's not even something to laugh about. No, it's quite bleak. But my question was trying to be a bit more hopeful. What hope can we hold on to for looking towards the future? Because you still do your work, so something still drives you.
Yeah.
So there is. Do you think we can still turn this around, or?
Yes, I think really indigenous peoples need to get a voice. I really think that it's fantastic with these events like the Global Landscape Forum that bring indigenous peoples to this space and really give them a voice here. But it's important to also translate that into the local realities. And that we need the solidarity with the movement on the ground. For example, we had one of our partners who is an Adivasi activist has been here and talked on the first day. They are extremely well organized and they are very mobilized and they are doing a lot of rallying against forest evictions. There potentially 7.5 million people will be evicted from forests in India over the next month.
Wow.
And that's an extremely terrible situation. It's an extremely high number, and I mean, where will these people go? And they will it's a very, very bad situation. And I think that there needs to be global solidarity with the movement itself, but listening to the movement, not like actions that complement the movement, but really supporting the Adivasis in India in their efforts to protest those developments. Yeah,
so I guess what you're saying is that, because it takes a long time to put the legal frameworks, which we don't have. So one way of making sure that this does change is, like you're saying, like protect, like support grassroots organization and their movements. And then we possibly
I think it's the solidarity with grassroots movements. I think the legal protection, developments of legal frameworks is also important.
Yes.
It goes in parallel. Also the implementation of international instruments that actually include safeguards and really ensure that is done right. For example, the Green Climate Fund has adopted an Indigenous Peoples policy last year, which is fantastic. It's a good policy, and so really the implementation of that policy in all projects that are being supported by the Green Climate Fund is crucial, and that's a responsibility of this international, the global community. Yes.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add that maybe I didn't ask you that you think is important about rights in the landscape. Is there anything else?
I'm sure I can think of many things.
I'm sure you can. I just want to see if there's anything you want to wrap up with. Please feel free.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.